first glance, it seems like the situation is under control. There are powerful countries and advanced weapons. But something is happening behind the scenes that's slowly changing the game. It's not immediately noticeable, but you can feel its effects. And once you understand what it is, it becomes clearer why the direction of the war suddenly changed. But before we start, don't forget to like this video. It means a lot to us content creators. Thank you very much, and now let's get started. As Iran continues its attacks using Shahed drones against Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf countries since February 28th, it seems like nothing can stop them. Cheap drones deployed in large numbers and continuous pressure from the air. In addition, the new leader, Murtaba, threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz and strike U.S. bases. For the Gulf countries, this is the breaking point. They have been under attack for weeks, and while they struggle to defend themselves against the swarm of drones, a new player has entered, not from the Middle East, but from Europe, Ukraine. And what they brought wasn't bombs or planes, but something they've long used in their own fight: anti-drone technology. This is the same technology they used to stop Shahed drones in their own cities, and it's been proven in real combat. And above all, it's cost-effective. This means you don't need an extremely expensive system to bring down something cheap. And this changed everything because suddenly, the Gulf countries had an answer to their problem. They won't just get hit anymore, and they won't have to rely solely on traditional air defense, because now they have their own way to counter the swarm. In a short period of time, 11 countries from the Gulf and Europe, including the US, looked into Ukrainian technology. It was as if they all moved away from the influence of Russia and Iran at the same time, and big deals started happening. Saudi Aramco, the largest oil company in the world, entered into multi-million-dollar agreements to purchase systems like the P-1 and Sting, anti-drone and electronic warfare solutions from Ukraine, with the goal of protecting their oil facilities against Shahed attacks. In the UAE, they didn't just make purchases. They invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Ukrainian missile manufacturers. This means they're not just users, but they also want to be part of the development. In Qatar, Ukrainian experts have also arrived. According to reports, 3 fully equipped teams were sent and divided among Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Their job is to set up the systems, train the personnel, and make sure the defense is ready against drone attacks. In other words, while Iran relies on the number of drones, their opponents now have new defenses that can counter that. And because of this, one of Iran's biggest advantages is slowly disappearing. Numbers are no longer enough, and being cheap is no longer enough. Because now there's technology that can stop them quickly and isn't that expensive either. This is the real change in the fight. It's not just because of strength, but because of the solution. And this time, the solution comes from a country that has long been fighting the same kind of threat. Behind this is the UK's swift entry. In this scene, it's not just a simple purchase of equipment. There's a deeper move happening. In Saudi Arabia, there are brokerage firms already negotiating with Ukrainian companies like Skyfall and Wild Hornets to purchase systems capable of taking down Iranian drones before they reach the oil facilities. This means they won't wait for them to hit. They'll intercept them in the air right away. But this move by Ukraine isn't just business. It's also a form of retaliation. Ukraine has had issues with Iran for a long time. According to Volodymyr Zelensky himself, when the Shahed drones were first used against Ukraine, it wasn't just Russian operators who were involved. There were people who came directly from the country where the drones originated. This means there is a direct connection and support. And for Ukraine, they have not forgotten this. That's why now they are doing what is called an eye for an eye. If the Shahed drones were used against them, they will help others to bring them down. And this is where the problem starts for Iran, because their main strategy, which is using cheap drones in mass attacks, is gradually losing its effectiveness. Before, the plan was simple: send a lot of drones. Even if some are shot down, some will still get through. And while the enemy was spending millions on missiles, they were spending very little. But now, the situation is reversed. The systems being used against them are even cheaper than the drones, and they can shoot them down one by one. This means the swarm strategy is no longer effective. Numbers no longer work because no matter how many are sent, they can all be taken down. And because of this, Iran will be forced to change its strategy. They can no longer rely on large-scale drone attacks. They need to be more selective, more limited, and more targeted. But there's a new problem. If they're not going to use those anymore, what's the alternative? Ballistic missiles. Heavier weapons like the Fateh 110 and Sejil. More powerful, faster, and harder to stop. But the trade-off is higher costs and more limited production. They can't deploy as many of these as they do drones, and they can't do it every day or in large quantities. In other words, if they switch to missiles, the number of attacks will decrease, and as the number decreases, the pressure on the enemy also lessens. This is what's called a fatal mathematical problem. Before, they were able to send a lot of cheap drones. Now they'll be forced to use fewer but more expensive missiles. Stronger, yes, but fewer. And in a war where continuous pressure is important, that's a big disadvantage. So at this point, Iran isn't just being held back. They're being forced to change their entire way of fighting. And often, in the middle of a war, forced change becomes the beginning of defeat. At this point, it's clear that Iran can no longer fight using their old style. They can't make hundreds of ballistic missiles every day like they do with drones. The reality of missiles is different. They're expensive, slow to make, and limited in number. So if they switch to this, the number of attacks will decrease. And, along with this, the continuous pressure that used to be their strength will disappear. A bigger problem is they'll also lose their way to avoid blame. Before, they used drones that they sent through the Houthis or militias in Iraq. When an attack happened, they could say they weren't responsible. They had a "that's not ours" card. But when ballistic missiles are used, it can no longer be hidden. There's a clear trajectory, a launch site, and it's easy to point out where it came from. And most of the time, it points directly back to Iran itself. That means there's no more hiding, and they will be held directly accountable. Here you can see that it's like Iran fell into their own trap. Their strategy for many years, using cheap weapons and relying on quantity to defeat a more advanced enemy, suddenly doesn't work anymore. This is what they call their approach under the axis of resistance. But now someone has responded to them using the same idea. Not expensive, but smart. Ukraine did this. They didn't counter it with a more expensive defense, but instead used a more efficient and cheaper way to bring down the drones one by one. So as a result, Iran's swarm strategy became useless. Now, if they want to recover, there's a clear direction. Make more advanced drones with stealth, AI, and the ability to resist jamming. But this is where reality comes in. This kind of development is not simple. It requires a lot of money, advanced technology, and a long period of time. And in Iran's current situation with sanctions and economic difficulties, it's almost impossible to do this right away. It would take years and billions of dollars. So because they're cornered, there's one option left, and it's the most dangerous. They could disrupt the Strait of Hormuz using sea mines and cyber attacks. This is one of the most important oil routes in the world. If they disrupt it, it won't just affect their enemies, but also the global economy. Especially countries that rely on oil like China. This means it's no longer a simple move to fight back. It's almost like an attempt to hold the world's energy supply hostage. But there's a price to pay for this. If they do that, the conflict will spread wider, more countries will get involved, and their downfall could happen even faster. In the end, the picture is clear. Just one move, the entry of Ukraine and the provision of anti-drone technology, changed the entire equation. Iran's former greatest advantage suddenly disappeared, and now they're forced to choose more difficult, more expensive, and more dangerous options. And the clearest evidence of this can be seen in the reactions of their own officials. There have been recent statements full of anger and pressure that show just how serious the situation is inside. One example is the statement made by Iranian MP Ebrahim Azizi on March 14th, which appeared in international media. This means they're not only struggling on the battlefield, even internally the pressure is being felt, and they're gradually losing control. At this point, it's clear that it's not just about the battlefield anymore. Even the words of the officials are becoming signs of the real situation. The statement that Ukraine is now at war, the entire country is a target, in the real world is almost impossible for Iran. They don't have direct access and they don't have easy logistics to reach the whole of Ukraine. This kind of statement is not a concrete plan, but a desperate voice of a regime that is already cornered. And while this is happening, a bigger change is quietly taking place. The balance of defense in the Middle East is shifting, not because of politics, but because of numbers. The problem of the Gulf countries is simple. They have advanced systems like Patriot and THAAD that are very effective against ballistic missiles. But when the enemy is a drone swarm, it's a different story. Think about this. An Iranian drone costs around $20,000, but to shoot it down using a Patriot missile, it would cost around $3 million a. That means if 10 drones come, you'll spend $30 million to shoot down targets that are even cheaper than one of your missiles. So you're at a loss right away. And this is exactly the problem that Ukraine has solved. Their interceptor drones cost only about $3,000 to $5,000 each. They're even cheaper than the actual targets. And they can chase and shoot down Shahed drones in the air. This is where the equation was reversed. Before, the enemy was the one spending a lot to stop your cheap weapons. Now, you're the one at a disadvantage, and the enemy has a cheaper defense. How did they do that? This didn't come from expensive laboratories or quiet research centers. It was made in the middle of the war. And in actual combat, Ukrainian engineers took the Shahed drones. They studied them, reverse-engineered the design, and created a system that precisely targets the drone's weaknesses: thermal signature, flight pattern, and speed. They use the enemy's own strength against them. That's why their system is not just about technology. This is survival instinct turned into a weapon. And this is the reason why Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries are not just buying. What they're buying is a system that's been proven in real combat. It's like an immune system against drone attacks. That's why there are big moves happening now. Saudi Aramco is talking to Ukrainian companies like Skyfall and Wild Hornets for anti-drone systems. In the UAE, the defense company Edge bought a 30% stake in the Ukrainian firm Firepoint for $760 million. This means it's not just a purchase, it's an investment in the future of defense, and it's not just equipment that's being sent. Even Ukrainian military experts are now coming to the Gulf region themselves to set up the systems, train people, and make sure they are ready for the next wave of attacks. In other words, while Iran is gradually losing an effective strategy, their opponents are not just defending, they're adapting, improving, and becoming more efficient. And in a battle where money and intelligence are at stake, these kinds of changes are what truly alter the outcome of the war. At this point, it's not just Iran that's being affected, but also the bigger players behind the scenes. The technology that Ukraine is bringing to the Gulf is not just a simple upgrade in defense. This is a major strategic move that directly hits the influence of Russia and China in the Middle East arms market. Let's first look at China's side. Beijing has long planned to become the main supplier of military tech in the region. They have products like wing-loom drones and anti-drone laser systems, such as the Silent Hunter. Their offer is simple: high-tech equipment with no political conditions, unlike Western countries. On paper, it looks good, advanced, and reliable, but when real combat came, the Gulf countries saw a different reality. They noticed that no matter how good a system looks on paper, if it hasn't been tested in real war, there's a big risk. And this is where Ukraine comes in. The technology they brought wasn't just designed. It came from the actual battlefield, tested in real attacks under real pressure and in real situations. So in the end, The Gulf states chose what was proven in battle, not just what looks good on paper. And this is a big blow to China. It's not just because they lost potential deals, but because it's a mismatch. It's the very concept that Ukraine is using now. Using cheap counters to bring down drone swarms directly contradicts the strategy that China also plans to use in the future, especially in a possible scenario in Taiwan. This means they didn't just lose a market, but their confidence in their own strategy was also reduced. Now let's look at Russia's side. The impact here is even heavier. Vladimir Putin has long been trying to strengthen relationships with allies through OPEC plus diplomacy and by offering Russia as an alternative partner to the U.S. They plan to fill the gap to become the new reliable ally in the Middle East. But what happened was the opposite. While Russia is at war against Ukraine, it's actually Ukraine, their enemy, that the Gulf countries are now talking to for their security. This is not just a simple discussion. Billions of dollars worth of deals are coming in. This means that the countries Russia wanted to have as partners have chosen their enemy. This is a huge embarrassment for Moscow. It's not just because they lost the opportunity, but because it showed that in the eyes of these countries, performance on the battlefield is more important than political alignment. And in the end, this is the clearest picture. While Iran is losing an effective strategy, Ukraine is becoming a new source of practical military solutions. At the same time, China is losing credibility in real combat, and Russia is losing influence in the region it wants to control. This is a chain reaction, a change that doesn't just affect one country, but the entire balance of power in the Middle East. And all of this started with a simple idea, a way to take down a cheap drone even more cheaply. At this point, it's clearer that this isn't just a simple defense deal. This is a major shift in the power balance. The deployment of Ukrainian military expert teams themselves to Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia to install anti-drone systems is a clear sign that Russia's influence in the region is weakening. Before, Russia wanted to become the alternative partner in the Middle East. But now, these countries are calling Ukraine itself their enemy for security. This isn't just about money. Yes, Ukraine is earning a lot from these deals. But more importantly, the Gulf countries have become like a lifeline for the Ukrainian defense industry. Instead of just receiving aid like before, now they are the ones providing solutions. And they're even getting paid for it. There's another important insight here. According to an analysis published in Foreign Policy, even former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton admitted that the most effective counter-drone technology today comes from Ukraine. This means that even countries that used to provide aid to Ukraine are now the ones asking for access to its technology. That's a big change. From being a country that asks for help, it has become a country that provides security. And not just any kind of security, but protection for the most important assets of the Gulf countries, their oil infrastructure. If you look at the bigger picture, it's not just the Middle East that's changing. Global energy security and alliances are changing too. Because whoever has the capability to protect the oil supply holds significant influence over the entire world. And this is where Ukraine's deeper strategy comes in. They're not just selling technology. They're using it as an exchange. While they provide a cheap way to shoot down drones in the Gulf, they're getting something in return: access to more advanced air defense resources. For example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have long had stockpiles of Patriot missiles, PAC-2 and PAC-3, which are extremely expensive and limited. Before, they were forced to use these against cheap Shahed drones, which was a huge loss in terms of cost. But now, because of Ukrainian systems, they no longer need to use Patriots against drones. They're being stockpiled now, and that's what's important. The remaining high-end interceptors can be part of a larger coordination or support that can also help Ukraine against Russia, especially with advanced missiles like the Kinjal or Iskander. In other words, Ukraine isn't just selling, they're exchanging value. a cheap solution in exchange for a strategic advantage. And in this process, three things are happening at the same time. Russia's influence in the Middle East is weakening. Trust in China as a supplier is disappearing. And Ukraine's value as a security partner is increasing. This is the reason why simple anti-drone technology has become a major move on the global chessboard. It's not just a fight against Iran. It's not just business. This is a step that is gradually changing who has control over security, energy, and influence around the world. At this point, the impact of what's happening goes even deeper, not just on the battlefield, but also in diplomacy and the global economy. Those Patriot missiles stacked in Gulf countries, which are extremely expensive and limited, now have a new role because they no longer need to be used up against cheap drones. Because of this, the focus shifts to more serious threats and through agreements and exchanges of resources. Some of these also become part of the support for the Ukrainian front. In other words, Ukraine's cheap anti-drone system frees up high-end weapons to be used in more critical battles. And here you can see why it's called a masterclass in diplomacy, because they're not just fighting, they're also managing the movement of resources on a global level. This directly affects Russia because while it's trying to use its air power, Ukraine's defenses are gradually getting stronger, using systems that become available thanks to these kinds of arrangements. But its impact isn't just military because it also reaches the global economy. Remember when the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia were attacked, oil prices suddenly went up and the whole world immediately felt it. The prices of goods went up, inflation worsened, and the pressure on the economy increased. That's how big the impact of the Middle East is on global energy. So while there's a threat from Iran to disrupt the oil supply in the Gulf, it's like there's a looming danger for the whole world that could raise oil prices at any moment. But because of the anti-drone systems brought by Ukraine, this threat is being reduced. As oil facilities like those of Saudi Aramco become more protected, the oil supply becomes more stable. And when the supply is stable, does the market's fear decrease? And when fear goes down, do the increases also go down? This means that not only the Middle East is being protected, but also Europe and the global economy. In this way, Ukraine has become like an invisible shield, because even if they are not seen on the front lines of the Gulf, their impact is felt all over the world. If you look at history, this is similar to what happened during the 1991 Gulf War, where the U.S. Patriot missiles were the answer to Saddam Hussein's Scud missiles. And that's where the U.S. influence in the Middle East became stronger. But now it's a different time because the enemy is no longer Scud missiles, but Shahed drones. And the answer is not just the Patriot, but also systems like Sting and P-1 Sun from Ukraine. It's like history is repeating itself, but with a new main character, not Washington, but Kiev. But there's another effect that isn't immediately noticed. As defense against drones becomes more effective, countries are being forced to change how they view war. The number of weapons is no longer enough, and strength is no longer enough. Now, resources need to be used more wisely, because if the enemy can be brought down by cheap weapons, using cheaper methods, relying on quantity loses its value. This is where the new reality comes in. The fight is no longer about who has more weapons, but about who has better methods and who can adapt faster, able to adapt better and knows how to make the most of what they have. In this kind of battle, a small advantage can grow, and those who were once strong can suddenly become weak, because in the end, it's not just technology that decides the outcome, but how it is used and who learns faster in the middle of the fight. And this is where the most important lesson comes out. It's not just strength or numbers that win, but whoever has the smarter way. A simple idea on how to bring down a cheap drone, something even cheaper, changed the course of the battle. And this time, that's the real victory.